My name is David Henry. I'm writing a book about Canada's disabled veterans. I'm making this tape in Wakefield, Quebec with Douglas MacArthur. The reason I'm making this tape is to alert disabled veterans to the possibility that they may have been misdiagnosed. The research behind this book began in August 1999 at the time of the confrontation between Sergeant Major Matt Stopford and the then Minister of National Defence, Eggleton. Matt, with cameras running, asked the minister, "Why are so many of us sick and disabled, and why won't you help us?" 24 hours later, the Minister of Defence sent out Brigadier General Patricia Sampson, the Canadian Forces Provost Marshal, to announce that Stopford was sick because he'd been poisoned by his own troops in Bosnia 6 years before. This poisoning allegation was debunked by toxicologists within 24 hours, who said that if there had been enough naphtha in his coffee to do him any harm, it would have tasted so bad he wouldn't have drunk it. RCMP Superintendent Russ Grab, a few days later, stated in an article in the Ottawa Citizen that the alleged poisoning did not cause Stopford's illness. I met Stopford in October 1999 and showed him a copy of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control diagnostic criteria for a disease called chronic fatigue syndrome. The British call it myalgic encephalomyelitis. The Great Canadian Compromise is myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. The acronym is MECFS. In 1993, the World Health Organization classified MECFS as a disease of the central nervous system. It affects brain and muscle function. Its impact, unless it's diagnosed early and managed properly, can be devastating, and it usually results in substantial disability. In an earlier career, I was Assistant Director of Health Sciences at the International Development Research Centre. One of my colleagues went on to become Canada's top doctor, Director General Disease Control at Health Canada. He had been my physician. His name is Dr. Joe Losos. I was diagnosed with this disease in 1991, and the first person I called was Dr. Losos. I said, "Joe, I've got this diagnosis, what am I dealing with?" And he said, "You're dealing with a very serious health problem that isn't taken seriously by many in the medical profession because there's no biological marker for it. There's no lab test. It's a clinical diagnosis. Similar to the diagnosis for multiple sclerosis, they eliminate everything for which they can screen and then apply a diagnostic criteria." In 1990, Health Canada issued an alert to Canadian physicians regarding MECFS. In 91, Dr. Losos told me it was a serious health problem. In 1992, a senior epidemiologist at Health Canada told me that if MECFS was a reportable disease like tuberculosis, it would be an epidemic. He estimated there would be 3,000 cases in the National Capital Region. In 1993, I met, quite by chance, a Canadian Forces officer from the medical service who had this disease. This officer had a PhD in biochemistry. She told me that the Surgeon General of the Canadian Forces denied that MECFS was a disease. In 1993, the World Health Organization classified MECFS as a disease of the central nervous system. Later, I learned that a number of officers from National Defence Headquarters in 1992 had been diagnosed with MECFS, and that they had been given pensions. So, in 1993, the Surgeon General says it isn't a disease, it is not a disease, and WHO classifies it as a disease of the central nervous system. A very important document in this whole scenario is a paper by Brigadier General retired Joe Sharp, written in 2002. The title is The Sand Beneath Our Feet. It can be found in the RMC archives, and Peter Stauffer, NDP Veterans Affairs critic, has a copy. In short, in this 14-page paper, General Sharp states that hundreds of Canadian Forces members were misdiagnosed and discharged as medically unfit for service. They were consequently denied proper medical treatment and disability benefits for which they had to pay. This is a very important aspect, the insurance aspect, because the insurer, Maritime Life, in the early 1990s was confronted with an unprecedented liability. Hundreds of young CF members were stricken with this disease and were substantially disabled. No provision had been made in their actuarial tables for an event of this kind. The terms of the contract were that the insurer would pay 75% of the salary of the individual who was disabled. The criteria was that the disabled former Canadian Forces member was unable to work at any job that would pay 66% of his previous salary. The issue of the misdiagnosis has been described as a professor of criminal law who read my research file as fraud. He said it's very simple. They paid their disability premiums and were systematically misdiagnosed and consequently denied any benefits. Again, I say, the professor of criminal law said it's fraud, and he reported this to myself and Brigadier General retired Ian Douglas personally at a meeting at my home in Progreso, Yucatan, Mexico. The disease, myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS, as I said earlier, affects cognitive, brain, and muscle function. What happened during the 1990s was, in order to deceive Canadian Forces members, they were told they were suffering from a mysterious illness. Later, in the 1990s, early 2000, this changed to post-traumatic stress disorder. I was alerted to the PTSD aspect of this deception in February of 2002 when someone brought a Toronto Star to Mexico. The front page article by Graham Fraser was headlined, Canadian Forces Ombudsman blasts Canadian Forces for bad treatment of 3,000 suffering from PTSD. I had never seen any reference to PTSD before in any of my searches. I went down the street to visit with an American Vietnam combat veteran, and I asked him about PTSD. I said, "Do you know anything about it?" He said, "I know a lot about it. I was among the first group of 150 U.S. combat vets that the Veterans Affairs put through a PTSD program in Bangor, Maine in 1979. I asked, were you physically unwell? Was your activity less than 50% of normal? Did you suffer from severe muscle pain and debilitating fatigue after what would be considered to be normal activity? Did you have cognitive problems? Did you have problems with sensitivity to light and sound? He said, no, we were strong as horses. We were just screwed up. We went into the jungle when we were 17 or 18, stayed there for 2 years, came home, we were shunned, and they expected us to be normal. Now, I mention this because it is very important. The PTSD deception has not only left a lot of disabled veterans without any disability insurance, it has left them very vulnerable to mistreatment. One of the most severe aspects of this is that people with myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, do not tolerate Prozac or any of its cousins. People with PTSD are routinely prescribed Prozac or its cousins. The outcome of this mistreatment is that a high number of Canadian and American veterans who were diagnosed with PTSD and treated with Prozac but actually had ME/CFS have committed suicide. And this is cited in a number of reports on this topic. People with ME/CFS do not tolerate Prozac and other SSRIs. All the information that I have shared with you here has been shared with the Canadian Forces Surgeon General, the Judge Advocate General, and the Ombudsman for the Canadian Forces, and Patrick Stogren, who until recently was Ombudsman for Veterans Affairs Canada. What I find most troubling is that both Patrick Stogren and Pierre Daigle, who are a colonel and a major general respectively, have not raised the issue of the misdiagnosis. Brigadier General Sharp stated this very clearly in his paper. In 2003, September, I discussed this with Brigadier General Sharp and specifically asked him about Andre Marin's, the Canadian Forces Ombudsman's statement in his report in 2002 about 3,000 Canadian Forces members suffering from PTSD. General Sharp said very specifically, only 20% of the 3,000 actually have PTSD. The other 80% mainly have ME/CFS. I mention this repeatedly because in conversation with a few disabled veterans, they have reacted very angrily at my suggestion that they have been misdiagnosed. They have been given a diagnosis of PTSD and they are disabled. But in March of 2005, the Canadian Forces chief psychiatrist, in an interview with Joe Friesen, Globe and Mail, Kandahar, Afghanistan, said, PTSD is a treatable psychological problem. It is not disabling. Please take time to read the diagnostic criteria for ME/CFS and PTSD. There is some overlap on the psychological aspects of the two diseases, but the physical disability associated with ME/CFS is impossible to confuse with PTSD. When I have asked disabled veterans if they have an activity level of less than 50% of normal, it tends to stop them dead in their tracks. They've never thought about their activity level. And if you have an activity level 50% less than normal, you have a health problem, a serious health problem. There are 2 or 3 excellent reference documents for people who think they might be suffering from ME/CFS. They're both British papers. One is What is ME? It's a 30-page document. It's guidelines for physicians and lawyers. And the other one is Myalgic encephalomyelitis, a baffling syndrome with a tragic aftermath, by Dr. Melvin Ramsey, an infectious disease specialist in England who was one of the leading authorities. The other really tragic aspect is that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, had this story in 1999. I gave the references and some of the key contacts to Francine Pelletier of the Fifth Estate. She researched it, and after 4 weeks of research, called me and said, "Mr. Henry, this is the most fascinating topic I have ever encountered, but it can't be told in 15 minutes." In December of 1999, she called me in Mexico to ask if I would come to Toronto for an interview with the Fifth Estate. They would pay the ticket. I was quite ill at the time, and we agreed that we would wait until April when I returned. By April, the CBC had killed the story. The political dimension of this story is very large. The Reform Party MP, Art Hanger, who set up the media ambush between Matt Stopford and the Minister of Defence, Eggleton, soon after it hit the national news, disappeared. A Liberal Party insider who'd been following this story with me said the Liberal Party couldn't survive this scandal. So why did the Reform people turn and run away? In my opinion, the reason the Reform Party ran away was there was substantial pressure from the insurance industry and possibly Mr. Bush and company in the United States. This was a much bigger problem in the U.S. military, and they didn't want this profile being raised anywhere. So what did they do? They left Matt Stopford, Sergeant Major Matt Stopford, twisting in the wind, having announced that he had been poisoned by his own troops. This was a doubly devastating blow to Matt Stopford. Matt sued the Department of National Defense, and 5 or 6 years later won an out-of-court settlement. An out-of-court settlement is secret, but it is an admission of guilt. There is another very useful reference book for this story. It is called Osler's Web. It was published by Penguin in 1997, and in it you will find a substantial history of the disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, as the Americans call it, in the U.S. military. Read it. Lastly, the Legion, the Royal Canadian Legion. The Legion had this story in 1999. I called Jim Rycroft, the Director for National Services. I briefed him. I sent him a 20-page file. He thanked me for the information. He said, "This is very important because we're having a meeting with the provincial directors of services for the Legion tomorrow." He retired. Pierre Allard took over, and in 2004 I called Allard, briefed him again, explained that hundreds of Canadian Forces members had been misdiagnosed. He is a former officer and quite angrily responded, "I hope you can prove this." I said, "The proof is in your files." Sadly, the Legion is basically a social club run by civilians and has done nothing for the over 2,000 Canadian Forces members who suffer from a debilitating disease of the central nervous system, ME/CFS. The book will take another year to finish. It's a complex military, medical, political, and media story. In the meantime, I would suggest if you need help, contact Peter Stauffer, NDP critic for Veterans Affairs. He is very well informed on the issue. Thank you.